Do you believe you're grounded in reality? Welcome, my Mere Mortalites, to another round of the book reviews. My name is Kyron, host of the Mere Mortals podcast, but also this one where I dive deeper into the books that I'm reading to give you the juicy information to take away some themes, extract some stuff that you can perhaps learn from, and maybe even question your own reality. Indeed, we do have Reality Plus by David Chalmers with the subtitle Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. So this book was published pretty recently, 2022. It's about 500 pages in length, and it took me a fair while to get through. I'd say probably 13, 15 hours in total. It's not super dense in terms of words, but in terms of the density of the actual word itself and the language of it, it can be relatively hard to get through. This book is an examination of what reality actually is, hence the title, Reality Plus. So his central thesis is definitely around this concept of virtual reality and making claims of what he believes virtual reality is and how this should affect our thinking. Now, there's kind of two styles melded into this book, which he combines together to call technophilosophy. So one part is results from technological process and things that are actually doable now with computers, and we can say, oh, okay, if this happens, this is likely to happen into the future. If this happens, we can see this now. And then also philosophical arguments that he makes and that have been made in the past. So we learn a lot about other philosophers over the centuries, millennia, in fact, and he discusses their arguments, their merits, and how it applies into virtual reality and how we can conceive of reality as a whole. So the book is split into 7 parts, and each of these adds up to a total of 24 chapters. Some of these chapter examples are things like, is God a hacker in the next universe up? Are virtual reality devices illusion machines? And do simulated lives matter? So it really gets into all sorts of varying topics related to philosophy. I'm going to get into the first theme that I've pulled out from this, which was virtual reality. Real as real can get. So what is real, I suppose, is one of the questions that really comes up in this book. And some of the philosophers in the past we see, such as Descartes in Meditations in First Philosophy, where he's questioning, is there an evil demon actually creating all of these things that I see around me now? Am I actually living in a dream? Plato's cave in Plato's Republic, which we've also covered on this book channel before. There's so many different ways that you could go about conceiving, okay, what actually is real? So David himself comes up with a couple of criteria, 5 criteria, in fact, that he uses, which you can find on page 114. And these are put as roughly this: reality as casual power, reality as mind independence, reality as non-illusoriness, reality as genuineness, and that was the last one. So when you've got this checklist and you can start ticking off some of these things and asking, okay, if I was in a dream, for example, right now, does this really exist? Does it have causal powers? Is it independent of our minds? Is it as it seems? Is it as a genuine X? And then he goes talking about how, okay, let's say I'm in virtual reality. Does it really exist? Well, it really exists in some method or manner, in that there are atoms and bits in a computer doing all of these things. So there is actually some existing of something there. Does it have causal powers? Do things happen to me? Do I perceive things when I'm actually in this virtual reality? Yes, you can say that. Is it independent of our minds? Yes, the virtual reality is a thing in itself, and we are kind of connecting into it. So yes, it's independent. Is it as it seems? Well, when you're actually in there, does it actually seem as if something is happening? Does it seem as if I reach out for an object and there actually is an object there, even though there technically isn't in some manner? It seems as if it's there. And then, is it a genuine X? And, he goes through all of these, and basically after applying all of these methodologies, you find that in most of these cases, which you can come up with as asking, is this real? He actually says, yes, this is a type of reality. It's a different reality, hence the name of the book, Reality Plus. It's not exactly the same as what we think is reality around us right here now. But if you were a brain in a vat, much like in the Matrix, if an evil demon was controlling everything, if you were perhaps trapped in the Truman Show, much like the famous movie, if you were actually a simulation, if you were having a dream, much like Zhuangzi and his butterfly dream, all of these, you can apply these criteria, and some will not pass it as well, but most of them kind of pass this reality test, and you can say, yes, that is an actual reality there. Now, what are some of the outcomes that come from this? So we said real as real can get. What does it actually mean if virtual reality is real? Well, a couple of things that he brings up in the book are, if we create simulations, for example, and we can kind of find out, or there is enough proof that those simulations are conscious, that is a real reality for them. And if we were to turn off the machine, that is kind of the equivalent of, killing everyone on planet Earth sort of deal. If we were to have be inside of virtual reality and, someone perpetrates some act of violence against me or some sexual harassment or things like this, that is real violence / real sexual harassment. There are some claims and some things, some differences, such as, if you kill someone in real life, it can be kind of different than if you killed them in virtual reality and then they pop back out into the real world. You can also have better lives as well. You can have a better life and it's a life worth living inside of virtual reality, are the claims that he makes. And so through all of these kind of arguments, investigations, philosophizing, he comes out with all of these sort of outcomes where you could say, okay, there's some real world practical applications of what he's talking about here. If you were creating a simulation, maybe you don't want to kill all of these things, or maybe you don't even want to create it if you start to see like, oof, these things are getting pretty conscious. I'm not sure I, want to keep the power on and keep this server running for the next, as long as possible, because now I'm responsible for, 8 billion lives, let's say, if you've created a simulation of Earth in a computer. So all of that is somewhat, there's a grounding to it of some sort. When the next portion, I suppose, or the other half of the book is related to the second theme, which is the simulation hypothesis. And I've kind of put the subtitle philosophical word games here. So what is the simulation hypothesis? You might have heard this before, and there's very many variations of this. I'm going to go to the two simple ones that he talks about here on page 29. So the first of this is from Nick Bostrom, who was somewhat the person who popularized this. And so in his version, he says, simply, we are living in a computer simulation. That's kind of his main core thesis. Chalmers repothecate that and says, we are and always have been in an artificially designed computer simulation of a world. Now, I'm not 100% sure if he had to put a probability on that, how much he actually would, or if he's just saying this for an illustration, because he makes many different claims and takes many different sides of arguments in this book. But that's the main sort of two variations of this. And then we get into, I suppose, all of the separate things that come from this. Okay, if we're in a simulation, am I the only one and everyone else around me is a philosophical zombie, i.e. there's no actual consciousness around? We can have mixed ones where it could be perhaps people coming in from a virtual world. So let's say this is virtual reality right now and there's people coming in and coming out, let's say when they die, and I'm actually just a simulation in it and there is no other me, a brain in a vat, a body or consciousness of some sort outside of this. That could be a mixed one. And then you could have a global one where it's, or the whole universe that we're living in is a simulation, and variations of this as well. It's temporary or it's permanent. You can go down rabbit holes of different imaginations of this, of, we're actually 5 layers deep and then there's, God is on the kind of first layer, things like that. Now, what this kind of introduces is skepticism, and you'll see a lot of this in the book where he is saying something and then because he's a philosopher, he's creating arguments against himself and kind of debating these. Not so much in the style like we talked about recently in The Courage to Be Disliked, where it's a real Socratic dialogue, but this is him just saying, someone might say this, I would say this in response. there's very many levels of this, and skepticism is basically the claim we cannot know anything at all in the broadest sense. And so you can have local versions of this and say, the cat that I own, that's actually a dog inside of a cat's body, and but that dog is melded into this cat, and we can't actually prove this, and that's a kind of local claim of skepticism. You cannot know that's an actual cat. There's more the Cartesian one, where the kind of, and this comes from René Descartes, which is the only thing I can kind of be sure of is my consciousness, but all of these other things around me, so it's almost at this global level, I cannot really know any of them, and you can make claims from that. And then there's the full global one, which is we cannot know anything at all. I'm in a simulation, and therefore I cannot know anything about the world around me because none of it is as it seems. Now, this is somewhat complex because we're getting into the philosophical word games here, which is none of this is really verifiable. And so the claim that we're living in a simulation is unverifiable. There's no way of us to actually prove it or not. And although this is a word game, it's not necessarily meaningless, much like many claims in the world are. Just because they can't be proved doesn't mean they're meaningless in themselves. But you do have to recognize, okay, I maybe wouldn't base my whole life around a concept which you cannot prove either way. You can have ways of trying to prove it, and this is getting into this concept of infinity, which I always seem to struggle with, which is the way that infinity is used, particularly in simulation theory, is there's got to be X number of simulations. We're creating simulations ourselves, and there's going to be an infinite number of simulations. Therefore, we are living in a simulation. There's sort of one statement, one kind of fact about infinity, and then therefore we're in a simulation. And the thing is, you can kind of use this as a coverall for many things, and it's actually, there's claims kind of underneath that. So for example, I could say if we were in a simulation, there's only a simulation of 8 billion humans. In infinite simulations, you would expect that there would be infinite simulations of a human being in that. We're capped at kind of 8 billion at the moment. Therefore, statistically, we wouldn't be in a simulation. You can kind of use all of these things, and then they would argue, but it's something related to simplicity or complexity. Maybe we can prove we're not in a simulation because simulations cut corners and things like this. And it just goes into this kind of whirlwind diving game of words and language. And Chalmers admits this himself when he's talking about one particular aspect of what he's debating, and he was saying, well, in this case, this person is using subjective language, and their meaning of this word is different from my meaning. And that I think is getting to the core of many of these things related to the simulation hypothesis and a lot of philosophy in general, to be honest, which is a lot of it is word games. Now, I don't think any real claims came out from this simulation talk in this book. Most of the concrete things you could talk about were what I already mentioned in the virtual reality section. And then all of these things are maybe philosophically interesting, but unprovable, unverifiable, and more just fun to talk about, which is getting onto my own observations and takeaways. I gotta say, I was a bit exasperated after reading through so much of this. There's just so many back and forths, and it at points becomes repetitive. To highlight this, I'm going to jump onto page 229/30, where Chalmers is talking about this virtual piano that could be in this park somewhere. So he's saying, on the other hand, why say the virtual piano is really in Washington Square Park? And so it's getting into this kind of word game of virtual objects in augmented reality. So if there was a virtual piano in this Washington Square Park, is it actually there and whatnot? And so I'll read this section. A natural resolution of this matter is to make a distinction. The virtual piano is not physically in the park, but it is virtually in the park. An object is physically in a space if it has physical matter that occupies that space. An object is virtually in a space if it functions as if it occupies that space. The virtual piano has no physical matter in Washington Square Park, but it functions as if it occupies the space. If the virtual piano seems to be physically in Washington Square Park, this is an illusion. The virtual piano is only virtually in the park, not physically in the park. On the other hand, if the virtual piano seems only to be virtually in Washington Square Park, this isn't an illusion. The virtual piano really is virtually in Washington Square Park. Look, maybe it makes sense to some people, but when it was getting to this level of this is this thing and this, I just found it like it was getting too much into the details, too much into the arguments, too much caught into its own webs of repetitive and whatnot. This is philosophy, so I accept that and understand it. But for a book, I just got to say, like, I struggled with certain aspects of this throughout the book. That being said, I would say it is relatively accessible compared to many other philosophical works I've read before. The writing is much more accessible. The theories, the way they're put out, you still have to work for it, I think. Hence why it took me much longer to read this book than it does a kind of typical book. But I think it is more easy for the general person coming from the outside who maybe hasn't thought too deeply about virtual reality or the simulation hypothesis. They could probably come into this and they're not going to take everything away, but I think you'll still maybe have some value come out from it versus something like Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology, which is just incomprehensible unless you have a degree which is more like poetry. And this book isn't poetry. It's certainly more on the hard effects of side, the technological sort of side, than the philosophy, airy-fairy poetry side, but it still has aspects of that. So in summary, it was a mixed bag for me. I thought it would start each section strong, and then it would just kind of lose its way a little bit. The arguments would start to get a bit too loopy, too hazy, too fuzzy, and a bit lost or muddled, to be honest, in the middle. And then it would bring it back usually towards the end of the section or the chapter. Personally, I wish there was more hypotheticals within the book or technological examples or his own experiences using virtual reality and how that has influenced his thoughts and things like that. Because he does do a bit of that anyway, but it kind of lacks that grounding, much like I said at the start. Is this grounded in reality? Sure, it's reality, but it might not have that pulling down force, which is somewhat useful at times. So I would say this is probably a beginner intermediate level of philosophy book. You'll learn a bit about virtual reality and about the simulation hypothesis and a bit about general philosophy over the many years. But how much of that is it really going to be applicable to your everyday life? I'd say not too much, but it can be fun, these word games and whatnot. So overall, I'm giving the book Reality Plus by David J. Chalmers a 6.5 out of 10. Yeah, it was all right. It wasn't too bad. So that is it for today, my mere mortalites. Thank you for joining me to the end of the book review. What are your thoughts on David Chalmers, on reality? Are we in a simulation? I would love to know all of these things. The best way to do that is via leaving a comment down below. I try and get to every single one of them. And then I would also just recommend checking out the Mere Mortals podcast. A lot of the ideas, concepts that I talk about in these book reviews, I also go over there and really dive deeper into it with my friend Juan and guests, and then sometimes myself as well. So wherever you are in this reality of ours, whether we be 1 layer deep, 2 layers deep, we are the simulations, wherever you are, I really do hope you're having a fantastic day. And until the next time, ciao for now, Karen out.